we're looking at construction, and we all have multiple eyes on the same problem.
Senator Wolk.
Yes, thank you. Both Dr. Bolin and Dr. Nekadam, Senator Pavley and her staff, as they were immersed in the negotiations on SB4, and that was certainly after both of you were seated in your positions. There was some concern that much of this information was really not shared with them, despite having asked for it. So what I want to know is what's happened, and also there were additional positions that Dogger got at that time, specifically to implement SB4. So what's happening now in terms of working with the requirements of SB4, the monitoring issues, and because there seemed to be some problems fairly recently in getting that cooperation happening.
I think Dr. Bolin can give you a more accurate report of the personnel hiring situation. We have been very, very aggressive in that. Good. And I think we're almost entirely up to staff. If I may, though, address more directly, there is a record here, and I think that the confusion and even the perception of misrepresentation on behalf of the department actually has a very clear record now. And I would defer to Secretary Rodriguez and the Cal EPA story to describe that in great detail. Okay. However, I think the simplest frame of that is up until 2012, it was the assumption of the districts from 1983 to 2012 that 11 aquifers were exempt, and they treated them as exempt. And that was the basis of their permitting in good faith. When the observation came through from actually our own employees that we had dueling lists of those 11 aquifers, they brought it to EPA's attention. EPA said, basically, no, we're going to go with what Secretary Rodriguez's report calls MOA 1, which did not have the 11 aquifers exempted. MOA 2, which is following 1985 Covington letter that was discovered in July last year. MOA 2 has the exempted aquifers, the 11 aquifers exempted. Our staff immediately posted the MOA 1 that did not have the 11 aquifers exempted, and the department assumed that that was the operating procedure because that's what EPA told us. In those basically 18 months, as we began to work with EPA to implement more rapidly the UIC program and ensure that we were accurate in our records, we discovered, as well as documents that were produced through Public Records Act in the department, as well as FOIA requests at EPA, that there were two completely independent and perceived to be completely real and legitimate competing lists. In July 2014, the Covington letter was discovered in a file cabinet in District 4 in Bakersfield, and that became essentially the controlling document. The misperception that we had during SB4 somehow deceived the legislature with that is because in 2012, we deferred to EPA's requirement that we use MOA 1 as the controlling document.
All right, so given all of that, and I assume that the implementation is going as expected, and are there changes then necessary to SB4 to amend to recognize that primacy issue?
My sense is, Senator, that SB4 is about as comprehensive as it needs to be, and we need to get to July 1 full implementation and see how we work. I think our biggest challenge in the division and at the department is our data management system. I think many of the problems and the misperceptions about the department and the division arise from the fact that we have essentially primitive data handling systems. We have paper files that require human beings to go look through them. It is my intention, being the person most responsible and being quite tech savvy myself, to entirely automate the permitting process and gain a business analytics capability so that a report to the legislature or a report to the public can be generated in days and not years. That's my goal, and I intend to pursue that aggressively.
Thank you.
Senator Jackson.
Yes, I'm assuming then that you're going to be making a request to Budget Sub 2 for an augmentation. I'm wondering if that would include a per barrel increase to the oil companies in order to pay for this data collection. Has that been considered?
That is under discussion in the Secretary's office and in the Governor's office.
Great. And my last question, my understanding is that we're talking about 23 wells, 11 wells, but that in fact there are 2,500 additional wells where we're injecting into potentially non-exempt zones, where 2,100 are still active. So is that accurate, that we're not just
It is accurate. There are 2,021 enhanced oil recovery wells that are injecting into hydrocarbon zones that are not exempted. They should have been exempted, and by law they should be exempted, and they will be processed as aquifer exemptions, but those are enhanced oil recovery zones.
So they should be exempted, you're saying?
Technically, yes. Well, technically, legally, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, because of the total dissolved solids of the water along with the oil, they should be exempted under the Safe Drinking Water Act.
What about the areas where we're now seeing, where they're injecting, that there's a concern about the potential for migrating water? Is that under consideration as well? Are the rules and regulations sufficient to address those possibilities? As we got to protect the water supply in the state because Mother Nature is not cooperating with us. But the last thing we need is to find ourselves in this predicament where what is potential drinking water is being compromised because either we've been asleep at the switch or our rules and regulations are not sufficient. And I appreciate Senator Stone's concern. We don't want to overregulate, but frankly, at the moment, we're not even complying with our own regulations. So first we comply with our own regulations, and then we have to look at trying to protect the integrity of the drinking water. Is that part of the discussion at this point, sir?
Well, application of our regulations do address zonal confinement. So there's thought about how we confine fluids to a specific zone, and geology does do that. It's not perfect. The subsurface is always full of surprises, but it is part of our regulations. But what I think I heard in your question, and I could be wrong, but I think I heard in your question is, how do we verify that? And that requires monitoring that's really, more that is really in the Water Board's bailiwick. We are together in the water monitoring business as it relates to hydraulic fracturing, but as we move forward, as we move out of the interim regulations into the permanent regulations, the Water Board will be lead on that aspect as well.
And do you have the resources you need, or will you be coming in requesting additional funds, and where would you recommend they come from if that's the case?
So we are having discussions with the administration on that. My recommendation would be that they come from a per barrel fee for underground injection oversight, and from the waste discharger permit fee for any waste discharge requirements associated with ponds or reuse of the water, since that's the appropriate funding mechanism. We take very seriously the potential for migration from one portion of the aquifer to another. Anecdotally, what we've been doing in the last few months working with the Division of Oil and Gas is looking at some of the aquifer exemptions requests, and our concern is has been how well that confinement is defined and explored, and we will continue to take that portion very seriously.
Thank you.
So I'll ask a question, and I'll ask Senator Allen, Senator Wolk, Senator Stone. All the fingers are going up. So far, the division's primary goal is to safeguard public health and the environment. No contamination has occurred. What happens if contamination is found? What's the state? Is the state going to try to undo it? Are we going to just identify? What would we do? if we found contamination in one of these aquifers?
Let me answer from the department's perspective. We basically shut down the operation as quickly as we can. But I would defer to the Water Board because aquifer remediation, as many of us know, is an incredibly complicated and difficult thing and often not very successful. So prevention is obviously the best remedy, and it is certainly our policy, our regulations, and certainly our intention to have the best prevention.
And so I'm clear, is that shut down the operation in the project or in that one well? Because sometimes the permit is for a whole project that may not have shown contamination prior.
Yeah, it depends on the nature and the source of the contamination. Wells do break from time to time. There are some situations in which continuing operating the well actually is required in order to recirculate enough fluid. I am not familiar with enough cases in California in which a broken well has contaminated an aquifer and what the remediation is. I think there are very, very few cases, if any, that we have.
Mr. Bishop, contamination's found. What is State Water Board?
So there's a couple things that you should know, is that we have a lot of history in addressing remediation of aquifers, and what I'll tell you is that you don't clean up aquifers, you contain the spread of contamination. That's what we would do. We would try and reduce hotspots where it was appropriate by pumping and treating and using that water for other uses if that was appropriate. But the biggest action is to contain it through hydraulic containment, which is putting in wells that extract water and keep it from spreading and moving.
Senator Allen.
So I guess I'm hearing you're finding no evidence of contamination, but at the same time, did I hear you right that you've only monitored 9 wells?
So let me be clear so that it's not a misunderstanding. We believe that any injection into the aquifers that are not exempt has contaminated those aquifers. We are asking for information from the operators on that contamination. What we found is that the aquifer, no surprise, has the material that was injected into it. What we have not found is that a active drinking water well has been impacted by that information. Those are two different issues. Right. And so.
Right. Well, and that's, I think, at the heart of the concern here and kind of the broader concerns that are in the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is trying to protect potential sources of safe drinking water in the future. So let me just ask a couple of questions along those lines, because we saw the February 6th letter, which of course does contemplate issuing permits for wells in non-exempted aquifers, and the language from the letter suggests that new permits will be issued for wells in hydrocarbon-bearing aquifers if the groundwater is in the vicinity of the hydrocarbon-bearer zone. So I just wanted to get a better sense of, you've set out this timeline. I'm trying to better understand why there'd be new injections allowed into non-exempt aquifers before February 15th, 2017. It seems a long way off, and we're talking about non-exempt aquifers here, and get a better sense of the logic behind the timeline, and kind of also see how you think that that's consistent with the Safe Drinking Water Act, which says that it's illegal to allow new wells into a covered aquifer before getting the exemption.
So there's a very specific circumstance under which that's allowed. It could be allowed. It doesn't mean that it would be, but it could be allowed. And that is for an existing UIC project. So that project already has to have undergone a project review, analysis, public comment, and so on and so forth. So only within existing projects and only within hydrocarbon-bearing aquifers, that is, water-bearing formations that contain oil and are therefore economically recoverable oil, and those are prime candidates for exemption under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So it's water that we wouldn't be tapping for beneficial use to begin with because it contains economic amounts of oil. So that's a very limited set of circumstances. It has to be within an approved project. It has to be in a hydrocarbon-bearing zone that has economically recover hydrocarbons. What it essentially means then, Senator, is that it's for a project of wells that have been approved, and they may be doing some infill drilling. So in other words, they may have 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen, 5 dozen wells already, and they're putting another well into where there are already a large number of existing, could be a large number of existing wells. So we anticipate that that is a very, very special set of circumstances, and that's what EPA agreed to.
Isn't the problem that they don't have the exemption, but you're still allowing the drilling? I understand the logic behind why you might want to grant an exemption because of the presence of hydrocarbons, but they don't have an exemption under the current process, which is required under law.
So and in addition to that, they would have to close in by February 15th of 2017 if the exemption weren't granted.
So 2 years away.
Right. Right. And the logic is that those are not potential sources of drinking water, and therefore so as not potential sources of drinking water, the injection into those aquifers is the prime reason they would be exempted, and why we all agreed that that was a circumstance under which we could allow, we all, meaning the Water Board, the division, and the EPA, we could allow some additional permitting.
Well, so I understand that. I guess and this kind of speaks to this growing relationship between DOGGR and the Water Board. To what extent are you looking at whether or not the groundwater in the vicinity of a hydrocarbon-bearing zone could potentially be used for groundwater, for drinking water, for other potable sources?
We are looking at that, and I'll let Jonathan discuss that.
That's the prime uses review that we're doing, is looking not only at existing use, but as we move forward on, is the water potentially usable? And what I mean by that is that is the depth at a depth that would be conceivable for drilling for irrigation or supply? Is the quality of the water in the groundwater suitable for cleanup and use?
Goes to your question.
Yeah, so I guess until we've determined that, we're still somehow allowing this activity in, that in non-exempt aquifers that have not received the exemption. So I guess I'm just having trouble with what I'm perceiving as a violation of the law.
Senator, if I may, it is not at all unusual for regulatory agencies to put an industry or operators on a compliance schedule. And we have agreed with US EPA that where there is not an immediate danger or potential danger to potential sources of drinking water, we will essentially analyze the situation and make a determination along with the operators, Water Board, and US EPA whether or not the aquifer should be exempted.
Okay. All right. So I see, so and it looks like you talk about in this February 6th letter that, only new injection under these circumstances will only be allowed if strict criteria are met. I'd love to get a better sense of what those strict criteria are and the extent to which there's going to be a public process. And remember, we're talking about, new injection in spite of the lack of exemptions and in spite of the fact that we haven't finished this study about the possible usability of the water impacted by this injection. So just love to hear a bit more about the strict criteria, because those strict criteria, of course, can be very important given the other issues we've been talking about.
Sure. Not to parse words, but I would offer a friendly amendment of new injection to additional injection. These are zones, some of which have had injection of Class II fluids going on for 30 or 40 years. So an additional level of injection into that aquifer is considered a reasonable risk by all of us involved in the regulatory process. The criteria, as Dr. Bolin was saying, it has to be a project that exists, and that project, again, to restate, a project in the UIC program is multiple wells. An operator applies for a permit to have a schedule of drilling, and usually a cap on the number of wells and the extent, the geographic extent of how far they can go out. And then the permit is issued, and they still have to get a permit to drill an individual well, a notice of intent. So there's the project approval, which does go through public comment, very often goes through CEQA, either local government or through the division, and is thoroughly reviewed. And it's on that basis that US EPA agreed that since it has been reviewed already and already disclosed to the public for environmental impact, an additional well within the project as approved is appropriate.
But okay, but you're still, I mean, in the end of the day,
Violating the law.
you know, I guess in these kinds of circumstances, you'd want to have more of this sort of, you'd want to have more public process, and you want to have more engagement given the ambiguity associated with the impact on the aquifers, and also, yeah, the impact on the aquifers, I suppose. All right, so I don't know, I hope you share that view. Just so I can confirm one other thing that associates with this relationship with the Water Board, I take it to understand correctly that Dogger and Water Board are looking at issuing orders to shut down wells sooner than 15th of February 2017 that could impact potential sources of drinking water, not just current sources. Is that right? That's
correct. And I should say that the Water Board isn't shutting down wells. The Water Board is asking for additional information under their information orders. The Division of Oil and Gas is asking for the shut-ins, just to make it clear.
okay. Another thing to just get confirmation from you, we heard from Secretary Laird about the commitment to public process. You know, it's mentioned in the February 6th letter. Do you have a plan to ensure public process associated with the 11 aquifers?
The review that those aquifers will undergo is an analysis of those aquifers. One of the reasons that those aquifers were, I think, a matter of discussion about exemption is that they had contained injection wells that were permitted in some cases decades before the Safe Drinking Water Act was envisioned. So there's a review of whether or not an aquifer exemption is appropriate for that, and that review is what the Water Board, the division, and obtaining data from the operators will be conducting. They have been historically treated as exempt, and they could continue to be treated as exempt if it's deemed appropriate that they meet the criteria for exemption that exists under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So first of all, we're getting the data, and then we'll decide what are the next steps after that. But exemptions, these are mostly, maybe exclusively, sub 3,000 TDS aquifers. So exemptions would require a review of the application for exemption by the state in EPA headquarters in DC. There'd have to be notification in the Federal Register, and there would have to be public comments. So the answer, I think, to your question is that pending a review of the data, in which those data may indicate that those aquifers are not appropriate for exemption, and injection would then cease. if they are appropriate for exemption, then we would follow the process to exempt an aquifer of that type. You want to add to that?
I just wanted I think I heard you say concern about public process, and prior to the state requesting an exemption, it would go through a public process prior to that exemption. And so if Dogger determined that an aquifer was suitable for exemption, and we took a look at it and we concurred, they would go out for public comment and review prior to the application being made to US EPA.
Okay, so, okay. So with this MOU that you're going to be drawing up, the EPA states pretty clearly there's got to be agreement. What happens if the water board issues findings that the criteria are not met? Is that, at that point the whole thing, the exemption's not granted? I mean, do both of you guys have veto power effectively?
So obviously we haven't written the MOA yet between us. We don't have that currently in the agreement, but we do have an agreement with the Division of Oil and Gas that we have agreed to with that they won't move forward without our concurrence as we move forward. So it isn't in a document yet, but it will be. And that's my understanding, but you should get their concurrence.
And the same goes for this expansion of this pre-2017 expansion.
Yeah, we will be looking at any new well proposals. We would not be approving, concurring with any that have any potential for existing or future beneficial use.
Okay.
What I think is important to realize is that any aquifer exemption is an application by the state. So there would have to be concurrence between among the Water Board, the Division of Oil and Gas, and probably the governor's office, because it's actually a decision by the state, in essence saying that the use of this aquifer, this underground space, is considered by the state to be best utilized in the Class 2 well injection program. And therefore, it's a state decision that then gets obviously reviewed by EPA.
Okay. Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask about had to do with this article that you've referred to as it relates to steam injection. And I guess the question I had was, could you, do you know that operators are injecting steam at pressures high enough to fracture the formation? Is that happening right now?
I believe it is. Steam injection into a diatomite requires that, in order to produce oil from a diatomite, you have to connect the pockets of oil-bearing fluids that exist in the diatomite. As I said earlier, the diatomite is a very unusual formation. It's high in silica, the shells of diatoms. They create little pockets where oil forms, but those pockets aren't connected. And so there's heating can cause the breakup and fracture of the formation. And so there's, to me, at least as I learned about this process, I am not deeply familiar. I'm not a petroleum engineer. I'm a geologist. I haven't become fully schooled in this. My understanding is the heat itself can cause fracturing of the formation, exclusive of having steam injected at pressures high enough to fracture the formation. These are relatively shallow formations, and actually causing the formation to break or crumble, which I think is a better description, it doesn't take much.
Okay.
And it's a process that's very different from hydraulic fracturing.
Yeah, right, it does sound, that sounds like it. Now, the AP story says that this steam injection that you've just described is illegal. You know, is that correct?
Too much pressure is illegal.
I think, so I think this is a situation where,
Well, okay, not that steam fracturing, but that you know, injecting steam underground at pressure so high that it cracks open underground rock formations is in violation of state and federal regulation. That's according to the article. I'm just trying to get clarification.
I'm sorry, Senator, I didn't have time to brush up on what our regulations say. I do know that our regulations are old, and they're not, have not kept up with current industry practice. So I'm happy to come back and talk to you about it, but I just don't have the technical briefings in, you know, to be able to do so.
I would appreciate that.
If I may just supplement that, the department and the division have actually been involved with multiple stakeholders for the last 5 years in looking at what would be the appropriate regulations. When the regulations were written, to which the article refers, more than 30 years ago, there were very, very few cyclic steam wells in California. And now it accounts for about 20% of the production. And there are 39,000 of them.
Now, I assume the feds have a set of they have a set of regulations maybe that are ahead of us.
I don't know about that.
The overall UIC program is essentially the referent for that, but we have our other oil and gas considerations for well construction, et cetera, that go beyond the fairly general